Hi everyone, welcome to week 7, video 2. So we've just seen Wittgenstein criticise Augustine for having a narrow conception of language use, language acquisition, and for focusing too much on the practice of naming things via ostensive definition. Wittgenstein says that ostensive definition isn't the foundation of language acquisition, rather it comes at the end after you have a prior mastery of lots of other words. Now Wittgenstein also says that ostensive definition and naming things is just one practice among many. We do many things with words aside from pointing and making noises. Wittgenstein invites us to imagine or remember everything that we do with words. We ask questions, we order people, we wish for things, we doubt things, we guess or surmise or hypothesize. We make cries for help or expressions of joy, etc. I mean, we do so many things with language. Wittgenstein's saying that this model of language acquisition, which only focuses on naming, and where basically the whole gamut of language use is exhausted by this practice of naming, is much too narrow, and that this narrow view is a mistake which has been prevalent in philosophy since at least Augustine. But in the background, remember, he's including his own prior work in this as a legitimate target of this criticism. So words don't just stand for things. Words are employed in lots of other ways and lots of other different practices. And Wittgenstein comes round to this idea that the meaning of a word can often be identified by looking at its use. So Wittgenstein has this example where he writes down 5 red apples, or he asks us to imagine someone writing down the words 5 red apples, taking them to a shop, and the shopkeeper receives the note, looks at a chart of words like red, green, blue with colour samples next to them, picks the colour corresponding to the word red, and then picks out, again, on a chart with, for instance, cucumber, banana, apple, and then a picture of an apple, picks out the thing corresponding to that word apple, and then picks out 5 of them and goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, Wittgenstein's point here, one of the points he's wanting to make here, is focused on this word 5. Or our focus right now is on the word 5. Wittgenstein says that if you ask people what they meant by the word 5, it's sufficient in answering that question to describe how that word is used in everyday life. So you might give examples of someone. We might say, look at this video of the shopkeeper picking out 5 apples. That's one example of the word 5 being used. We might show them another video of someone picking out 5 hats, and go, that's another example of how the word 5 is used. And Wittgenstein thinks that giving the use of the word is sufficient to give the meaning. He says giving the use doesn't involve pointing at some object somewhere and going, that is 5. That is what the word 5 stands for. And remember, this is kind of this is the model of meaning that Wittgenstein's opposed to is that everything has a meaning just in virtue of standing for a thing, and the thing is its meaning. He says, well, with the word five, we can look at the way it's used. It's used in certain ways, and telling someone how it's used or showing them how it's used need not involve pointing at some object and saying, that is the meaning of the word five. So Wittgenstein says, well, the meaning of a word is its use. And the meaning of a word is its use in a certain practice. The meaning of the word give can be identified by looking at the way it's used when people give people things, right? So the meaning of the word give has a use in a certain practice which people engage in. When you're giving the meaning of the word give, it doesn't make sense to look for some object called give. To do that is to make a mistake. And the kind of mistake it is a mistake which Wittgenstein makes and Augustine makes, which is to focus on naming as the only practice which we engage in when we use language. So Wittgenstein goes through lots of different examples, which we can discuss in further detail in person. He comes down to this idea that it's too narrow to look for objects, and he makes this very important distinction, which he had not made in the Tractatus, between the bearer of a name and the meaning of a word. And he thinks that what he's done in the past is confuse these two things. So Wittgenstein says there's lots of different practices, and he calls these things games, language games, which is very, very famous sort of slogan. And Wittgenstein's point in calling them games is to draw an analogy between practices of language use, all the different things we do with language, wishing, guessing, hoping, right, ordering, etc., and draw a comparison between that variety and the variety of games. There are other comparisons between the two, but one of the comparisons Wittgenstein is making in this section of the text is to say that if you ask someone what is a game, and you ask them for a definition, they're not going to be able to give you one, because games are much too various. Think about chess versus tennis versus, what's Wittgenstein's example, singing Ring a Ring of Roses versus, I don't know, pretend hide and seek or something like that. Games are just too various to give a single common underlying unifying definition which covers them all neatly. And Wittgenstein thinks, well, this is a really good comparison to make with language as well. The practices of language are much too various to be underpinned by some single essence. And right at the end of the reading, on sort of page 32, Wittgenstein says, well, this is exactly what he was trying to do in the Tractatus. He was trying to give an underlying, unifying, generalizable definition of all of language, i.e. sentences are pictures, or combinations of pictures with the use of logical operations. Wittgenstein's saying, no, that's not right. Just as games form a collection with no real common element, so do the practices of language. And then Wittgenstein makes another comparison. He says, well, let's take a family. Let's take 10 generations of a family. From each generation to the very next, there will be an obvious resemblance. between, let's say, mother and son. But between the 10th generation and the first, there may be no obvious resemblance or no resemblance between the two specimens greater than the resemblance between one of them and someone who isn't a member of the family. So Wittgenstein's point is that we use the word game to cover all of these completely different things, because when you get given one game, like tennis, you can see a similarity between tennis and golf, because, for instance, they both use balls. Then you might be able to use a comparison between golf and backgammon, because both can be played on one's own, and then a comparison between backgammon and chess, because they're board games, etc. And then we've got from tennis to chess. They're not like anything like one another, but because the steps in between bear resemblance, we are misled into thinking that there's a kind of unifying thread between all games. There isn't, and it's completely pointless to look for one. It's a kind of philosophical impulse to theorize and to produce overarching theories of phenomena which are not unified, that leads us to want to find this kind of underlying feature common to all games. Wittgenstein's point is that you're not going to find that. You might be able to find resemblances between specific instances, but if you chart a course of resemblances between enough instances of games, you'll see that you've got from something to something else where they're not similar at all. Wittgenstein thinks that language practices are like this. And Wittgenstein thinks, therefore, that you're not going to be able to give a theory of how sentences have meaning. Not one theory for all, anyway. And this, again, is to reject what he tried to do in the Tractatus. And he says at page 32, he says, here we come up, and in paragraph 65, here we come up against the great question that lies behind all these considerations. For someone might object against me, you take the easy way out. You talk about all sorts of language games, but have nowhere said what the essence of a language game, and hence of language, is, what is common to all these activities, and what makes them into language or parts of language. So you let yourself off the very part of the investigation that once, i.e. in the Tractatus, gave you yourself most headache, the part about the general form of propositions and of language. He says, and this is true, instead of producing something common to all that we call language, I am saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common, which makes us use the same word for all, but that they are related to one another in many different ways. And Wittgenstein's point is that to understand how a particular word has meaning, you have to look at the role that word plays in a particular practice, a particular game, if you will. Another analogy between games and practices, language practices, is that Wittgenstein will, as we go on, we will see that Wittgenstein thinks that words have kind of rules of use. Rules governing their correct use or not. And this is somewhat similar with the case of games. I mean, Wittgenstein routinely uses chess examples and likens word use with making a move in a game of chess. And so that's responsible later for his talk of making a move in a language game. And his point is that to make a move or to say something has to be done within the context of a certain linguistic practice. So to ask a question has to be done within a certain context. And Wittgenstein makes the point that that someone who had never played chess, never heard of chess, didn't know what chess was, but happened in the wild to come up to a chessboard with all the pieces set out correctly, and happened to knock the pawn 2 places forwards, wouldn't be playing chess. Imagine they accidentally knock it with their hand as they move past it. That's not the same as playing chess, even though when someone plays chess, they do sometimes, when they start, move the pawn 2 spaces forwards. Wittgenstein's point is that the person who's just knocked the pawn and has no understanding of chess and never seen a chessboard isn't acquainted with the practice of playing chess. They don't understand the context, and therefore, even if they mimic what people do when they play chess, they won't be playing chess. So we have this relationship between games and language. There's sort of 2 different analogies going on that I've discussed. One is the fact that games are completely various. There's no underlying unifying thread. That's the same with language practices, Wittgenstein says. And secondly, we have this other notion of making a move in a language game, i.e. saying something, using words correctly, requires that you have an understanding of the rules at work in that practice. Just as playing chess requires more than that you just happen to move a piece in a certain way. It requires that you know what the rules are and the context associated with playing chess. Obviously, this is very, so far, quite compressed. Wittgenstein also draws an analogy between words and tools. So we've got whole sort of language practices as games. That's one analogy Wittgenstein makes. Another analogy is between words and tools, and this is just to make a similar point again. He says that you can have 5 different levers in the cabin of a train. They all look superficially similar, but they all do something completely different. One's the brake, one's a valve, one's a switch, etc. And Wittgenstein wants us to see that this is true of words as well. We're kind of misled into thinking that words all have a meaning, all mean something in roughly the same way, just because they look superficially similar. They're often inscribed using ink and don't vary that much. And Wittgenstein thinks, well, a similar thing can be said to tools. There's ways of describing tools to emphasize their similarity, but that similarity would belie huge differences. Differences which the philosopher needs to pay attention to. And he says, elsewhere, he says, don't think, but look. I look at the phenomenon of language use. So that and video 1 were a sort of rough, simple-ish introduction to the first sections of the philosophical investigations, up to section 75. Obviously, we've missed lots out in these videos, and we need to discuss them more in person. But I think that's enough for these videos as a kind of overview of some of the main themes that Wittgenstein's trying to get across in these early sections. But we will return to these themes again and again up until the end of the course, because they occur again in uncertainty. Okay, thanks everyone, and do formulate as many questions as you can to bring to the in-person sessions. Cheers.